Thank you very much to you all for coming today. For those of you who have never been here before, perhaps I should introduce myself first. I'm Shihiko Gato. I'm the Northeast Asia Program Associate here at the Wilson Center. For those of you who have never been here before, the Wilson Center was established as an act of Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Over the last 2 years, there have been a number of grassroots democratic movements at work, and power has been unleashed with civil uprisings across the Middle East. And civil resistance movements have gained a new vigor with the advent of social media. And social media has really leveraged on both sides, both in allowing organizers to mobilize more people, and it's also enabled more of us outside of those areas to be engaged and to understand how the authorities are responding to these activist activities. There has been, what this has actually done for us is to bring to light the many disgruntlements that are echoed across the world, from a widening income gap, human rights violations, political corruption, the list goes on. But these issues are not unique to the Middle East. And across Asia, these have been issues that are not new. In fact, they have been prevailing for a very long time. So the question today that I hope we can address is, are we on the cusp of an Asian Spring that echoes that was seen in the Middle East? Certainly there are many changes on the horizon. We've already seen change in Burma. There has been rapid political transition in that country, and there are many new opportunities, but the country is still a long way away from achieving true democracy. Elections have been held in Cambodia too this year, and the opposition leader has been able to come back to Cambodia after 12 years of exile. Indonesia will be having an election, both a parliamentary and presidential election next year. And I hope that today Nobuo Fukuda will be able to talk in detail about what is on the horizon for Indonesia and how its past may be reflected in its future. Nobuo, as many of you may know, is currently a senior scholar at the Wilson Center. He actually first came here as a Japan scholar in 2011, having been a staff writer for Japan's premier newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun. He has held a number of very high-ranking posts with the newspaper, including the Jakarta bureau chief. He is, I think he is one of those very rare people who are not only intellectuals, but also willing and able to go out and get the news with his own feet and observe with his own eyes and tell stories that are very pertinent to society today, both intellectually and with compassion as well. He has covered numerous war zones, including Iraq and Afghanistan. But he's also a treasure to the Wilson Center because he is a key member of our softball team. I deeply regret that we will have to say goodbye to him at the end of next week. And he will actually be returning to Asahi Shimbun on October 1st. So with that, Nobuo.
Thank you very much, Shihoko, for your very, very kind introduction. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome and thank you all for attending this event today. As I will leave Washington soon, it's really nice to see dear friends, colleagues, distinguished guests here today. For the past 2.5 years, I've been extremely lucky to be based here at the Wilson Center and conducting an independent research on regime changes in Asia. It's been fantastic to work at this resourceful institution in such a cordial atmosphere. I'm deeply indebted to Center staff my assistant interns, and fellow scholars. I'm especially thankful to Bob Hathaway, Shihoko, and Mary Ratliff of the Asia program for hosting and promoting this event today. More acknowledgements may be made later. And now I'd like to get down to talk straight, since I got a lot to talk today. But I'd like to try to make it as short as possible. Well, after more than 2 years, since the Arab Spring broke out, this is the Cairo's Tahrir Square in 2011. It's November, so it was already after President Mubarak was ousted. But still a lot of people. Some Western media argue that it has ended up in a tragic failure. I think that it's a little too early to conclude that way, yet it seems we already learned some invaluable lessons from the Arab Spring. One of those lessons is that building a functional democracy from the ashes of authoritarianism could be as challenging as removing a dictatorship. That is to say, in a regime change drama, Act 2 or Chapter 2 could be even more difficult than Act 1. In that context, Indonesia's transformation since 1998 deserves more attention, as it has been widely acclaimed as a success story of a democratic transition. For the past couple of years, Freedom House has ranked Indonesia as the only country which is free in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is geographically large, very crowded, with 240 million people now, and culturally diverse, and still somewhat impoverished country. It's a fascinating country with very nice and friendly people. But according to modernization theory, those socioeconomic preconditions wouldn't be very conducive to democracy building. If this unlikely democracy is truly a success story, how have the Indonesians managed their own part two, Act 2 of a regime change drama? What kind of reforms have worked and what have not? With these questions in mind, I've been working on this big project, provisionally called Asia Spring. Excuse me, I'm really allergic to pollens, the kind of losing voice. I apologize. I witnessed the late strongman, President Suharto, his final years in power and his fall in May 1998 as a journalist based in Jakarta. Since then, I've been back to Indonesia from time to time for a follow-up. I would hardly call myself an expert on the country, but I might be kind of well-positioned to compare the past and the present and understand the significant changes that have taken place for the past 15 years. Today, I'd like to start by discussing how far Indonesia has come in terms of its democratic reforms. Then try to explain how and why things have turned that way. And lastly, what kind of implications Indonesia's experience would have for Asia and beyond, particularly for the nations expecting their own transformation in the future. Let's take a look at what has come out of Indonesia's regime change. First of all, elections. This is a mass rally held by one party. In 1999, this is the first free and fair election held in Indonesia in 40 years. Today, it is difficult to refute an observation that Indonesia has become a vibrant electoral democracy. Now people elect their leaders from a president to mayors to village heads themselves, as well as their representatives at legislatures at all government levels. That fill around 16,000 seats. Since the transition started, the Indonesians have carried out 3 general elections and elected the president twice by direct ballots. That's him in the center. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono is the incumbent president of Indonesia, and he's been elected by direct ballots twice, in 2004 and 2009. Direct elections to choose local executives, like provincial governors, district heads, and mayors, were also introduced in 2005. So thousands of elections have taken place across this vast archipelago in a decade. What is noteworthy is that both international and domestic observers have largely agreed that most of those contests were conducted in a reasonably free, fair, and non-violent manner. What were the Indonesian elections like in the Suharto era? At that time, there were only 3 political parties that were allowed to participate in elections. The candidates were thoroughly scrutinized by the security apparatus before they could run in elections. Suharto's party, called Golkar, never failed to win landslide general elections every 5 years while he was in power. Governors, district heads, and mayors were formally chosen by local assemblies, but in reality, they were handpicked by the president. And many of those posts went to active and retired military officers. So people didn't have any actual choice. Now, as the amended constitution guarantees liberty of assembly, the number of the political parties that participated in the 2004 general election, the first one held after the constitution was amended, was 24. Since then, 8 of them have emerged as the major parties in national politics. Direct presidential election has made a big difference too. Until 1998, the president was chosen by the People's Consultative Assembly, known as NPR in an Indonesian acronym. The NPR was a 1,000-strong super parliament, nominally the supreme organ of state sovereignty, and had hundreds of unelected members appointed by the president. Those appointees included Suharto's sons and daughters and his cronies. With no term limit for the presidency, Suharto was elected 7 times by the men and women, mostly handpicked by himself. And reform number 2, after elections, division of state power or checks and balances. Many of my friends in Jakarta agree that the single most significant constitutional reform was limiting the presidential term to 2 5-year stints. For the purpose of preventing the resurgence of a dictatorship, it is really crucial, they say. In another move to check the executive power, the position of the national parliament, the legislative branch, is drastically enhanced. The amended constitution designates the parliament as a sole institution with the power to make law. The old constitution granted the president the power to make statutes in agreement with the parliament. So how to abuse this power and monopolize the legislative authority? The parliament was rendered a rubber stamp for decades. An independent constitutional court was created in 2003 by the amended constitution. The court is mandated to judge whether a law made by legislators would agree with the liberal and democratic contents of the amended constitution. The function of this function of judicial review had never been granted to Indonesian courts before 1998. So the establishment of the court was seen as part of politicians' serious effort to restrain themselves. Power was also redistributed between central and regional governments. In the early 2000s, the far-reaching devolution policies were introduced. Their control over considerable political, financial, and natural resources were transferred to district and municipal governments directly from the center. Millions of civil servants were moved from the center to the region. Reform number 3, dramatic expansion of civil and political rights. The amended constitution has provided Indonesian citizens with a right to work and live in human dignity, a right to receive just and appropriate reward for work, a right to physical and spiritual welfare, and many more. This impressive array of innovative rights exceeds those guaranteed in even most developed states. Immediately after Suharto stepped down, all political prisoners were freed. Since press reports were heavily censored or self-censored under Suharto, people used to rely on rumors in order to know what their leaders are doing. Now they just turn to cell phones. Their robust news is readily available through social and mass media. Reform number 4, civilian control of the military. In this field, the reform is somewhat questionable, since the army has refused to give up its territorial command system. With that system, the army keeps garrisons based in all 33 provinces. It makes it look as if the soldiers are occupying their own homeland. Nevertheless, the military's influence on political economy has been significantly curtailed under democracy. Active officers don't fill the high-ranking posts at both central and regional governments as they did before 1998. Dozens of appointed members from the armed forces faction at the national parliament were gone. Well, a number of remarkable changes. So far, so good. Next, let's take a look into who have come out of the reforms as major actors. Here, I'd like to pay attention to a few particular groups because they are numerically abundant and they wield unique influence over political economy of the nation. Number 1, gangsters, known as preman in Indonesian language. I'd like to have this man, Mr. Yoris Raweai, as an example. He's a member of the national parliament and sits on the central board of Golkar, one of the largest political parties. Golkar used to be Suharto's political vehicle, and its members later regrouped as reformers. In the past, Yoris was known as Indonesia's most prominent underworld figure. Yoris ran one of the largest youth social organizations, Pemuda Pancasila, in English, Pancasila Youth, which boasts millions of membership across the nation. Ostensibly, Pemuda Pancasila was a youth wing of Golkar and fiercely defended the regime during the Suharto era. On the other hand, the group was involved in smuggling, illegal logging and mining, gambling, prostitution, drug dealing, extortion, and many other illicit businesses. One Jakarta-based journalist describes the organization as a state-sanctioned crime syndicate. There are a couple other youth or paramilitary mass organizations that have been active since the Suharto era. In a 2009 publication, one scholar estimated that more than 200 parliamentarians in the 560-strong national parliament were from those organizations. Also, hundreds or even thousands more local assembly members have emerged with similar backgrounds. New actor number 2, the oligarchs. Oligarchs try to dominate national and local political economy by using their massive personal riches. In general, their motives are defending and enhancing their wealth. This group in Indonesia should be represented by this man, Abu Rizal Bakri. Oh, this is Pemuda Pancasila, sorry, I skipped it. He's a tycoon and runs a conglomerate that holds together mining, palm oil, gas, telecommunication, broadcasting, finance, real estate, and so on. He used to be called King of Coal of Indonesia. A few years ago, his clan was listed as Indonesia's wealthiest family by Forbes Asia magazine. Their asset was valued more than $5 billion US. Bakri entered politics in 2003, and now he is a chairman of the second largest local party. He wouldn't conceal his presidential ambitions for 2014. when the incumbent president, Sirobamba Yudhoyono, will step down after serving 2 full terms. The oligarchs currently occupy a number of influential public offices, the head of major political parties, cabinet ministers, provincial governors, district heads, and mayors. The ways and means that oligarchs accumulate their wealth vary, but they usually start building their business empires by taking advantage of Ua's patronage. Both gangsters and oligarchs were deeply entrenched in the ruling mechanism of the Suharto regime. Why those seemingly undemocratic, reactionary, and predatory forces have achieved power in an age of democratic reform? Well, political parties willingly recruit them. In a new competitive electoral environment, they need organizers who could mobilize voters to campaign rallies and eventually to polling stations. The gangsters, with a mass organization background and networking skill, are the ones that parties could rely on. Also, running in an election takes a lot of money. Of course, not just in Indonesia, but particularly in Indonesia, since the new electoral law in Indonesia requires candidates to be nominated by a party or a coalition of parties as they seek executive offices and seats at both national and local assemblies. This prerogative has boosted parties' political and financial clout, with almost no financial assistance granted by the state. Party leaders turn to wealthy oligarchs to add to their coffers and even enrich themselves. In return for nominating, the parties demand candidates pay fees. Despite newly acquired fundraising tools, most parties have hardly rooted in communities. Consequently, the party leaders also expect the candidates to finance and run their own campaigns. They would even suggest the candidates buy off voters. This parasitic behavior of political parties has invited excessively inflationary money politics. One recent study estimates that the campaign expenses for winning candidates in district head elections averaged $1.6 million US. Nevertheless, there's no shortage of the list of hopefuls. Oligarchs calculate the purchase for candidacy would pay off if they won, expecting to exploit state assets and steer public policies to serve their own interests. In post-Suharto Indonesia, the situation of the institutions of democracy and liberty, especially elections, have been relatively successfully installed. On the other hand, some parts of government, which could be as important, have remained largely unreformed. Those are the institutions of law enforcement and governance. In today's Indonesia, corruption is still as rampant as it was in the Suharto era. Judges take bribes, prosecutors take bribes, policemen demand bribes, so do officials at government departments and state-run enterprises. For the predatory forces like gangsters and oligarchs, corruption is fundamental to their way of life because they need to work with corrupt officials and officers in stealing from the state, running illicit businesses, and being protected from prosecution. In truth, corruption was never inherently built in Indonesia's judicial culture until the period of brief constitutional democracy in the mid-1950s. There are well-trained and professional judges, prosecutors, and law clerks. They are mostly a leftover from Dutch colonialism, historians say. However, as the first President Sukarno imposed an authoritarian regime called the guided democracy, the armed forces moved to weaken an independent and effective judicial branch. After succeeding Sukarno, General Suharto completed this job. In his own style of personal rule, the ruler, not the law, would decide what was right and what was wrong. By the way, oligarchy didn't exist in Indonesia either before Suharto, according to Jeffrey Winters of Northwestern University. As Suharto tried to legitimize his regime through development, he needed capitalists who could kickstart international businesses dealing with Indonesia's ample natural resources, agriculture, and manufacturing. Suharto mostly nurtured ethnically Chinese oligarchs, allowing them monopolies of lucrative businesses dealing with natural resources, agricultural commodities, and other state assets. The reason was ethnic Chinese were politically and socially vulnerable, with anti-Chinese sentiments widely shared by indigenous communities. Thus, despite their massive wealth, Chinese would never threaten Suharto politically. For Suharto's patronage and protection, the Chinese businessman returned ample kickbacks, functioned as his fundraiser in need, and helped him enrich himself as the biggest oligarch in Indonesia. By contrast, Suharto didn't trust the indigenous oligarchs like Mr. Bakri, except for his own offspring. He suspected indigenous oligarchs could challenge his presidency if they acquired excessive wealth. Suharto steered the most lucrative deals away from the indigenous oligarchs. He didn't allow them to seek high political offices either. After Suharto was gone, however, there was no one who could restrain those ambitious oligarchs. With a rule of law and effective governance absent, their wealth could be easily translated into political and economic power. Some oligarchs managed to survive the Asian financial crisis by bribing commercial court judges. Those corrupt judges helped the oligarchs hide their assets, which had been put up as collateral for the loans from the state-owned banks. The Indonesians do understand what the problems are. In 2003, the government established an independent institution in order to tackle corruption. The Corruption Eradication Commission, well known to the Indonesians as KPK in an Indonesian acronym, is granted power to investigate and prosecute corruption cases in a special court. The commission has arrested and prosecuted a number of politicians, government officials, law enforcement officers, and business people, including incumbent president's brother-in-law. While cheered by the populace, the hatred and resistance directed toward the commission by the powerful have been fierce. In 2009, the two KPK commissioners were accused by a police general and high-ranking prosecutor for taking bribes themselves. Later, the accusation was found to be a total fabrication. But anti-KPK conspiracies have run rampant. As a model of future judicial reform, the government built a grand new building to accommodate the Constitutional Court in Jakarta. This is the building. The purpose was establishing the court's authority and prestige. Much better salaries are given to its 9 justices than ordinary court judges will receive. Since its inception, the Constitutional Court issued a few landmark decisions. In 2004, the court found unconstitutional a law that denies the citizens previously related to the Communist Party the right to seek public offices by prohibiting their candidacies. Now the Constitutional Court is largely recognized as transparent and competent. However, during the 2 terms of the first directly elected president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Indonesian people have not witnessed a reform to trickle down to ordinary courts. While the promises of the Arab Spring was still fresh and inspiring, some renowned experts on democratization theories started guessing where would be next. Last year, their flagship periodical publication, Journal of Democracy, expected another big wave of regional democratic transition would most likely emanate in East Asia. Unlike the Arab world, however, in East Asia, not a small number of nations have democratized from the 1980s on. During a few decades since then, South Korea, Taiwan, too small. The Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia gave up on authoritarianism. Most recently, Myanmar's unexpected political opening has attracted a lot of attention from the world. the changes have materialized rather sporadically. In my view, nevertheless, the springtime has been here, in Asia, for quite a while, and will unlikely go away soon. Mass movements seeking individual freedom, equality, and dignity have spread globally. That is another lesson that we learned from the Arab Spring. As this perception has been shared more widely, for the remaining authoritarian states, wherever they are, it seems to be getting more difficult to survive for many more decades to come. For the past 15 years, Indonesia's democratic transition has progressed gradually but steadily. Despite a number of defects sitting within the new polity, it seems quite unlikely for the Indonesians to turn back to an illiberal society. Indonesia's experience could have some significant implications for the region and beyond, particularly in long term. Indonesia's democracy has dealt another fresh blow to the proponents of Asian values. Until his fall, Suharto was one of those proponents, along with leaders of Singapore, Malaysia, and China. They aggressively argued that liberal democracy and human rights imported from the West wouldn't work in Asia, and the Asians know better ways to govern themselves. Since the transition, however, Indonesian leaders have clearly kept their distance from Asian values. Instead, they try to identify Indonesia with democracy and human rights in the international community. Consequently, Indonesia's diplomacy has changed. It advocated a more democratic Southeast Asia and urged the regional grouping ASEAN come up with a new charter which obligates member states to uphold the principles of democracy. The charter was adopted in 2007. Indonesia also played a central role in creating the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, a mechanism to promote regional cooperation on human rights issues in Southeast Asia. Despite ASEAN's principle of mutual non-interference, Indonesia openly criticized a member nation, Myanmar, for the lack of improvement in democracy and human rights. Indonesia also demanded Aung San Suu Kyi be released from house arrest. It's not clear how influential Indonesia's pressure was, but I guess at least it couldn't have had a negative effect on Myanmar's dramatic shift in the past few years. By the way, an Asian nation far preceding Indonesia in democracy building is India. This is an election held recently. It's a long queue waiting to vote. In geopolitics, the fact that India and Indonesia, the two regional giants in South and Southeast Asia, have consolidated open and competitive political systems encourages us to foresee a democratic future for a greater Asia. In the context of policy implications, what can we learn from Indonesia's experience? In a couple of years following the fall of Suharto, separatist and communal violence widely spread and caused the deaths of nearly 20,000 Indonesian citizens. In each of those conflicts, local population vented long suppressed grievances about excessive central government control and violation of local interests under Suharto. This provoked grave fear that Indonesia was on the verge of national disintegration, like Yugoslavia about a decade before. Indonesia's transition was no less acclaimed in the international community for restoring stability out of this chaos under democracy than for achieving democracy itself. In this sense, however, the newly installed local democracy played a part. As stated previously, the central government initiated massive local autonomy in the early 2000s. Then, direct elections of local executives followed. Local elites, oligarchs, and gangsters initially turned to violence in competing with each other for control of state resources. But after those reforms, they laid arms and scrambled for elections. Winners are given lucrative contracts and concessions, land deals, bureaucratic appointments. Even losers were entitled to spoils. Some of them were even allowed to carve out their turfs and create new districts. The spoilers were accommodated and absorbed into the electoral system rather than excluded from it. Political violence gradually quickly subsided. As a lesson for other nations in the region and beyond, in this case, what worked on the ground was realpolitik. It was a complicated mix of democratic politics, like elections, devolution, and considerably undemocratic practice of using spoils and patronage. In Indonesia, the newly installed electoral democracy replaced the long-standing autocracy. Nonetheless, democracy itself did not remove the predatory forces that benefited from the old regime. Our former colleague at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Don Horowitz, describes Indonesia's transition as an inside job. The authoritarian and nationalistic old constitution was amended solely by professional politicians, many of them former South supporters. But even if they were somewhat reactionary, democracy was an imperative after 3 decades of the repressive autocracy. Those old regime insiders were instinctively aware that they could survive democratic elections, but effective governance and the rule of law could be major obstacles for them. Some scholars argue that rule of law and good governance are dividends of democracy and often follow a democratic transition. However, as we have seen in Indonesia's case, while gangsters and oligarchs rise to power through electoral processes, effective institutions of law enforcement and governance hardly materialize. The reason is that they simply benefit from the absence of those institutions. As another important background of the absence of the rule of law, it should be noted that justice was never done about the gross abuse of power in the past. After stepping down, Suharto was prosecuted for illegally amassing the fortune. Later, he was acquitted on the grounds of his poor health and passed away peacefully in 2008. None of his children's business empire went under. They are the eldest daughter of Suharto, the eldest son, and the second son. There are 3 more children. They're all conglomerate owners. Among the military officers who were involved in massive atrocities committed in East Timor, Aceh, and Papua, the most responsible perpetrators were never punished. Above all, nobody was held accountable for the mass killings of the leftists, wherein 500,000 to 2 million civilians were slaughtered from 1965 to 67. It is often the case that new democracies wrestle with controversial issues of transitional justice. They must decide whether prosecuting a former leader will help or hinder reform and national healing. In Indonesia, some observers insist that the nation wouldn't have restored social peace and stability and come this far had Suharto and other perpetrators been punished. Nevertheless, as this political culture of impunity persists, justice and the rule of law will be hard to come by. While the springtime has spread globally, intuition is that the remaining authoritarian states in Asia, including China, North Korea, and Vietnam, where people are not even familiar with elections, will not survive, at least the way they are now. Expectations are that those nations will establish more open and competitive political systems eventually. But the big question is how those nations will get there. Paths to the opening act of a regime change drama, namely removing a dictatorship, are still quite elusive. In the Act 2, however, Indonesia's experience could be referred to. The nation would need to build new institutions of democracy, namely universally franchised free and fair elections, protection and promotion of civil and political rights, and civilian control of the armed forces as they try and steer the transitional process away from chaos. At the same time, they will be required to establish credible institutions of law, enforcement, and governance. Ideally, the newly established legal system could be stronger than the most powerful political actors. I know it wouldn't be easy. Conceptions of rule of law widely differ from nation to nation, even within Asia. For example, in Vietnam, the parties are unwilling to be bound by law, not to mention North Korea. In China, the party and state must act within the limits of law according to the constitution. However, practice lags far behind. I just recall what has happened to those brave human rights lawyers in China who challenged the party state and demanded ordinary people's constitutional rights to be upheld. Many of them had their lawyer qualifications stripped. Some were arrested and even disappeared. In Malaysia and Singapore, the ruling party uses the legal system to harass political opponents. So the fundamental question of a proper relationship between politics and law will likely remain in most countries for quite a while. On the other hand, many other problems are institutional and technical in nature, like the weakness of legislative system, legal profession, and administrative law system could be reformed with assistance from the neighboring nations with relatively mature legal systems, such as Japan and South Korea. To conclude, I'm hopeful and optimistic about Asia's more democratic future, but that future still holds tremendous tasks for those nations in waiting. I'd like to stop here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. If I may ask the first question, I want to go back to your comments about the power of oligarchs being part of the integral fabric of government. Obviously, they have much say in the allocation and control of natural resources, which is the foundation of Indonesia's economy. If true democratization were to be achieved, are there alternative scenarios, alternative systems that are currently being debated, or does Indonesia have to really go back to the capacity building of training people and having the instruments in place so that alternative systems can be in place, so that the economy doesn't get slide?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Thank you, Shihoko. The rule of law did not exist either under Suharto, but the oligarchs were restrained, as I stated, by Suharto himself, since he was suspicious of their motives. But I think if Indonesia had the functioning legal system in place, that would restrain oligarchs in a sense, even without the existence of the more powerful figure than oligarchs. And in that sense, I mean, I don't think if that would materialize, that wouldn't deal any serious damage to Indonesia's economy, because that could lead to fairer or more transparent practice and ways and means to conduct business. Many international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank have been frustrated with Indonesia. I said the corrupt judges help the oligarchs hide their assets, put up for collateral. But the same thing happened to the international plaintiffs. So that kind of mess could be eradicated if they could successfully put kind of the rule of law in place. That's my opinion.
if you could wait for it to come to you and identify yourself.
Charles Silver. I realize that most of your presentation was focused toward the idea of the rest of East Asia. But as you talk about Indonesia, I have the feeling that there's a very large elephant in the room that you haven't addressed, and you've taken a look at Indonesia primarily in the end of the 90s during the transition from Pak Harto's regime. Could you, you've talked about the future, and you factored in the Preman and the oligarchs. The Preman are really just subsidiaries of the oligarchs. Could you say a word or two about the role of political Islam? After all, your title is called Springtime in Asia, and I assume it draws its inspiration from the Arab Spring, which is inseparable from political Islam.
Thank you. Very good question. Yes, I didn't touch on Islam at all today. Well, I didn't intend to play down the role played by Muslims in Indonesia. They are in a sense, absolute majority, which accounts for nearly 90% of the population. So it's the most populous Muslim nation in the world. But the big difference between the Arab world and Indonesia is it's not an Islamic state. And basically, I understand from my experience living there, it's a secular state. And it's true. I mean, particularly immediately after Suharto stepped down, there are a lot of conflicts, violence. I mean, took place. I mean, which looks like a religious conflicts. But I understand there are always instigators. I mean, who try to take advantage of those cleavages, social cleavages. I mean, ethnic, religious, that kind of stuff. So no, I'm not really playing down the the role played by Muslims, but the probably even Muslims. I mean, organized political parties, but none of the those political parties, even if they call themselves Islamists, are far from Islamist in Indonesia. So this fundamental secularism would kind of help steer Indonesia away from religious extremism, and that's my understanding.
Yes, Mike Anderson is my name. I have one question on the elections, which are not that far off in Indonesia. Could you make a prediction on how the elections could go, and specifically as they relate to two issues, and that is relations with the U.S.? Indonesia-U.S. relations are very cordial, probably the best they've ever been. And also in terms of APEC and leadership, SPY has been a strong advocate of a changing and dynamic APEC. So what impact do you think the election will have on those two particular issues?
Thank you. It's a very interesting topic for a newsman like me. And so far, well, the presidential election will be held next year, the general elections too. And particularly important is maybe presidential election, since the incumbent president will step down. And so far, according to surveys, opinion polls conducted by media or research organizations, indicates that one very unlikely strong contender, I mean, who has risen quickly. His name is Joko Widodo, governor of Jakarta. He was just a mayor of Solo or Surakarta. It's a medium-sized town in central Java last year. And he ran for the gubernatorial election in the capital Jakarta, and won kind of landslide. Not really landslide, but it was a pretty strong showing. And he was just a salesman of furniture when Sartre was in power. So he was not a guy who was entrenched in the Sartre regime. So if the surveys were correct, and if the party he belongs to, the PDIP, is a party of the former president Megawati Sukarnoputri, endorses him as official candidate for the presidency next year, it's going to be likely for him to win. And that's going to mean probably the very first generation after post-Sartre would emerge as the major political actor in Indonesia. That might sort of dramatically change the political economy of Indonesia. You asked about APEC, and probably for Indonesia, an international grouping which is more important than APEC is ASEAN, and the ASEAN will officially enact its free trade zone. I mean, in 2015. But for the moment, probably Indonesia is the least open, trade partner for the rest of the ASEAN nations. So this has a lot to do with APEC too. But the Bogor Declaration was, as you know, it was adopted in Indonesia in the second APEC in 1994. So Indonesian government feels kind of obligated to carry forward the liberalization of trade and investment. But domestic politics kind of hinders. I mean, pretty much. I mean, the opening up of further, Indonesian markets. So if a completely new regime comes out of next year's election, that's going to be a kind of contentious issue, including relations between the United States too.
Hi, my name's Lauren Javins, coming from the Mansfield Foundation. I was wondering what your views on Mongolia were, since it's another democratic nation in Asia and didn't mention it, so I was just interested in hearing your views.
I gotta be honest, I really don't know much about Indonesia enough to comment. What I know is they also created a constitutional court, and as in Indonesia, it has kind of worked. In some countries, a constitutional court hasn't worked, like in Thailand. Usually, a constitutional court has a authority to disband political parties, and in Thailand's case, many of those suits filed by the political forces have been kind of politicized. And many political parties have been scrapped. But it's not the case in Mongolia, I heard, neither in Indonesia. And well, in general, what I hear is Mongolia has been doing well, relatively, in the transition. I'm sorry.
Jose Colazo, I was wondering if you could elaborate on I'm not sure if there's a or an agreement between the Indonesian military and the government, because it seems like they have you mentioned that they still have these barracks out in the regions and refuse to go. I mean, they're in the barracks, which is an issue in Southeast Asia, where they are quickly are able to mobilize. I live in Thailand, and obviously that's a big issue about which way the army is going to swing this week. So I was wondering if there is an agreement, unsaid agreement in Indonesia between the military leadership. I know that they're very involved in the economy of Southeast of Indonesia. Is there something to basically, buy them out gradually as the leadership exits?
Thanks, good question. So long as I know, there's no official agreement between the government and the military. It's what they have now. The garrisons based in all provinces across the nation is just a status quo. So the military simply refused, even if the government demanded, they go back to barracks. They wouldn't. And you touched on the business, the military business. Also, they made a pledge to return or transfer all the military businesses to the state by the year 2019 or something. Or could be earlier, but they haven't yet. But the government couldn't force them. Well, they see the military officers to be powerful, and another reason is they ask for even help from the military officers in elections or in other occasions. So it's not a good idea to fall out with military leaders for civilian politicians. That's what they have.
Yes, my name is Kunio Kikuchi. And you mentioned what struck me was that there are 240 million people now in Indonesia over this vast stretch of about 7,000 islands. Not too long ago, I remember there were only about 100 million people. Now, can you comment about the ethnicity of the people of these islands? Once I remember I went to Bali to meet some electricity power company official, and he said, well, Mr. Kikuchi, I'm very lonely over here because I come from not Sumatra, but from near Bandar Aceh, and there's nothing common with the people over here. They even speak different languages. Now, in that sense, is there any particular group that dominates the military, the particular group that dominates the language? Is there any move for diversification? Those are some of the concerns I have.
Thank you. Indonesia is clearly a multi-ethnic state with probably a couple of hundreds. Well, I would say 100 major ethnic groups with their own languages, their own cultures. And what you found in Bali was the people are, they believe in Hinduism mostly in the island of Bali, and if the electric company official you spoke with was from Sumatra or wherever. He might have been a Muslim. So it's a really diverse country. But until the end of South rule, there was a clearly predominant ethnic group that is Japanese. The Japanese explains maybe, well, still less than 50%. 45, 44 something. But it's the biggest ethnic group in Indonesia. And the people used to say only a Japanese could become an Indonesian president. And until Suharto, it was true. Both Sukarno and Suharto, the first and second presidents, were Japanese. But after Suharto, it was a myth, Tory. And the massive devolution project, conducted by the central government, was partially aimed at kind of readdressing the kind of distorted balance between the Japanese and other ethnic groups living on the outer islands. That, you know, well, you know, some predominance of, you know, particular ethnic groups, I mean, or something like that, is not really in place now. I mean, so long as I know. But they compete each other, of course.
I guess we have time for one more question.
Oh, but I think
If you could just speak loudly. Sorry. Oh, there is a microphone.
Yeah, to follow up on that last question, I was wondering how widely Bahasa Indonesia is spoken in the country. Are there large areas where it's not spoken?
All over the nation, I mean, lingua franca. I mean,
Officially, but is it really spoken everywhere?
Yes, I mean, even at home. But, well, that depends. I mean, you know, even some, you know, ethnic groups spoke their own language at home, and they learn how to speak Bahasa Indonesia at schools. But, you know, Bahasa was originally, you know, lingua franca, I mean, spoken by, you know, traders in the Malay, you know, peninsula and islands. So, you know, other local languages are pretty much close to Bahasa, many of them. But some languages are totally different, like the Japanese, Balinese, those languages. Or in New Guinea, I mean, people speak totally different language. But in many parts of the archipelago, you know, people speak Bahasa as a, you know, pretty much common language. And that's kind of props up its nationalism. I mean, it's a pretty much useful tool for the rulers too.
Before we go our separate ways, I know that the director of the Asia program, Bob Hathaway, wants to have the final word.
You don't need that.
And it's boycotting him.
Thanks. I just cannot escape the sense that this is bittersweet for us, Nobu. You came here for 4 or 5 months, and we somehow persuaded you to stay here for 2.5 years. We clearly got the better end of that deal, but we're going to miss you. I want to acknowledge your family, thank them for sharing you with us. We wish you good luck and Godspeed as you go back home. We, of course, will stay in touch. But I think it's also important, as a final note, to acknowledge that you had nothing to do with the fact that we had such a lousy softball team the last several years. And with that, I think we'll be adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.